Dear students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. M.P. Stija, Professor retired from the Department of Library and Information Science, Guru Nanak Dev University, Amritsar. Topic to be discussed is the work in the idea plane. Essentially, they work with the characteristics. Characteristics are some sort of hammer or criteria to divide an area into its elements or the concepts. And the choice of characteristics is quite important, and also is the arrangement or the sequence or the order in which these characteristics are applied. Before Raghunathan, classification work, rather the art of designing classification schemes was mostly intuitive or a matter of flair. Some born gifted people like D.V. Ranganathan or C.A. Cutter designed their classification systems without any theory or guidelines before them. Ranganathan designed his colon classification in 1933 without the guidance of any theory or model before him. Classification theory, then prevailing, is described now as static theory of classification as contrasted from dynamic theory prevailing now. Systematic theory of making classification was published in 1937 in the form of Ranganathan's Prolegomena to Library Classification. But the 20th century society, with proliferation of education and libraries, needed more classification and classificationists. Moreover, users and librarians expected more from classification than to be a simple tool for arrangement of documents on the library shelves. It was becoming a tool of information analysis and synthesis. It became a tool for conceptual analysis of knowledge and information retrieval. Therefore, making of classifications could not be left only to people with flair for this work. It had to be expanded. Some mechanism had to be discovered and formulated to design it. Ranganathan did it, and in the most important work breakthrough of simplification was to divide the work of library classification designing into three serial but interdependent phases called three planes of work. One of his important contributions is to divide the whole work of classification into three planes, namely the idea plane, verbal plane, and the notational plane. He formulated clear canons, principles, and postulates for work in this each plane. All these laws are subject to the overarching normative laws of library science, formulated by him and published in 1931. The work in the idea plane, though invisible to a classifier, is the most important one. It is the planning stage of the total work of classification, which lays down the foundation and sets the map of the classification system. Here, a classification maker is concerned with dividing the entities into smaller and smaller groups until every member gets uniquely individualized till no further division is possible or required. Further, these are systematically regrouped into categories, facets, and isolates. The work of idea plane doesn't stop until each entity is properly ranked by arranging them in arrays and chains. Grammar of classification design. Dr. S. Ranganathan very correctly described his respected and very able teacher William Charles Sayers as the first grammarian of library classification. No doubt that he was, because in his very famous book, Manual of Library Classification, he described the theory of classification which went into the making of classifications systems before Ranganathan. But at the same time, Ranganathan paying his homage, at the same time, Sayers paying his respect and love to Ranganathan, he described Ranganathan as universally acknowledged as the foremost grammarian of this field. Ranganathan's logically trained mind turned the work of classification from an art or intuitive art into an objective science, which could be followed and worked upon even by not so gifted minds. With his dynamic theory, Ranganathan objectified and mechanized the process of designing and evaluating library classification that he did through a long list of scientific canons and principles. The work of dividing an area of knowledge into smaller concepts is done by characteristics. A characteristic is sort of a hammer to break the universe into smaller and smaller entities. For fine classification, we have to apply characteristics not once but many times. So these twin characteristics deal with first the qualities of the characteristics and then the order in which these characteristics are to be applied. That's also equally important. So the canons of characteristics, that is, the qualities of characteristics are: number one, canon of differentiation. It means that the criteria that we apply should allow us at least two groups, or should differentiate the group or break the group into two groups or two parts at least. Then is the canon of relevance. It means that the criteria that we apply to divide a group should be relevant to the purpose of classification. That is the ultimate, the user's utility. Then the third quality of a characteristics is the canon of ascertainability. That is the criteria or the characteristics. It should itself be ascertainable, certain, and concrete. Then lastly, it is the canon of permanence. That is the characteristics that should you apply should be permanent. It should not be temporary, or it should remain there concrete and can be examined at any time. After choosing characteristics by applying these qualitative measures, we pass on to the canon of succession of characteristics. It means in which order these characteristics are to be applied uh, or placed to get a good classification. First is the canon of concomitance. It means that the classification that we choose should not result again in the same grouping. Then canon of relevant succession. The succession that we or order that we arrive should be relevant to our purpose. And third is canon of consistent succession, means the succession that we get should be consistent if such an idea occurs or such a group occurs in some other area of classification, so that the uniformity remains. By applying this canon of characteristics and canon of succession of characteristics, we can have a very good qualitative classification. Characteristics. Classification at best is a paradoxical process. We divide to regroup, analyze to synthesize, separate the constituents to reunite them. The work of dividing entities is done into categories and facets with the help of characteristics, and ranking is done in arrays and chains with the help of principle and postulates. The whole process falls under the purview of the idea plan and is carried out with the help of four sets of canons as follows. Canons of characteristics, these are four in number. Canons of succession of characteristics, which are three, and four canons for arrays and three canons for making chains. The canons of characteristics are concerned with the inherent qualities of the characteristics to be used as the basis of division. Of course, characteristics is a criteria for dividing a universe of knowledge into smaller units. A characteristics is a sort of hammer to break a mass of knowledge into smaller pieces. In other words, it is the criteria or basis of division. Definition of characteristics. Raghunathan defines the characteristic as an attribute, quality, or the basis with which a group may be divided into smaller groups, at least two in numbers. Further, he uses the term division characteristics. The entire universe can be divided into two groups of living and non-living. Here, life is a characteristics of division. However, Ranganathan has interjected a new term, parameters. Parameter is also some sort of a characteristics. The term characteristics and parameters mean the same thing. Attributes. An entity, whether physical or conceptual, living or dead, a process or an act, may have a number of attributes, both inherent, which are permanent, and given or assumed, which can be changed. The more complex or sophisticated an entity, the more characteristics it will have and more aspects it will have on which it could be further divided. Therefore, the selection of characteristics to form the basis of classification is a very judicious process. You have to think which characteristics should be chosen for dividing a group or an entity. The success of classification and its intended purpose will totally depend upon two things. Firstly, upon the skill of selection of characteristics. That is more important. And of course, secondly, on the order or sequence in which the various characteristics are used. Because for making groups or classifications, we have to apply not one characteristics, but many characteristics in some order, one after the another. Among the canons of characteristics, it means the qualities of characteristics. It implies that a characteristic common to the whole group should not be used as the basis of its further division. A common characteristic that is shared by the entire group will not be able to produce any division in the group. For example, you cannot divide human being on the basis of having a head or having two hands, because all of them have this one, and human beings cannot be divided on this ground. For example, being a student of library science cannot be a characteristic to divide library science class, because all of them are the student of this class and it will not divide them further. Similarly, we cannot divide crows on the basis of their color as they are all black, but shades of variation in the universal characteristics can be used on the basis of differentiation. Another example, the possession of two eyes cannot be characteristics dividing a group of normal human beings, but the shape and color of eyes can be a good basis for grouping. A class of library science students can be divided by gender into males and females or by religion, etc. Canon of relevance. The next criteria to select a characteristics is that it should be relevant to the purpose. It is more important and more difficult too. A chosen characteristics may satisfy the canon of differentiation. Of course, it may be able to divide the group into two, but it may not be very useful. A differentiating characteristic is not right or wrong. It is more helpful or less helpful, depending upon the purpose of classification for which it is being made. For example, a group of persons can be divided on the basis of their age, height, gender, skin color, mother tongue, religion, caste, race, nationality, education qualifications, and many more and other numerous characteristics. But for the purpose of desired grouping, all of them may not be relevant. For example, height, weight, gender, race, and physical strength may be relevant characteristics for selecting a class for physical training, but for forming a class for teaching mathematics, these are irrelevant. For this, only relevant characteristics are educational qualifications or the language known. Relevance to the purpose. Simply speaking, the selection of characteristics should be correlated only to the purpose of classification, but this cannot be done a priori. It requires vision and experience. There is no mechanical formula to determine the relevance of a characteristic. Raghunathan admits that it is a real problem to select the relevant characteristics among a large number of differentiating characteristics. It requires genius, flair, and experience to reject the less helpful characteristics and choose the right and relevant one. Relevance of a characteristic entirely depends upon the purpose of classification. Application of different characteristics means a different classification, of course. The real problem remains not to find the relevant characteristics, but to find the more relevant ones to design more helpful classifications. The problem is not of means, but of ends. The canon of ascertainability. This canon addresses itself to the inherent qualities of the characteristics to be applied. The canon of ascertainability asserts that the characteristic itself should be tangible, concrete, and objective. It should be perceptible to any of the five senses. The characteristics should not be illusory, mythical, or controvertible. It should be concrete at best. For example, one's previous birth may be a differentiating or even irrelevant characteristics to divide human beings, but certainly it is not ascertainable conclusively. Hence, it should not be used as the characteristics of division. Characteristics should not be subjective. For example, let us take another example. The date of birth can be a characteristic to divide living being, but the date of death cannot be so to divide a group of living beings, because the date of birth cannot be known for a living man. So, for a living person, the date of death is not ascertainable, and hence it cannot be used. Secondly, but less rigorously, a group of teachers should not be divided on the basis of being brilliant or dull, nor literary authors should be classed as major or minor. Not because these qualities do not exist objectively, they do. It is rather mostly due to the fact that these characteristics are very much subjective. These depend upon the perception and opinions of the observer. Whether a person is good, brilliant, or dull depends upon the viewer or depends upon the person. It is subjective. It cannot be universal. Hence, such characteristics should be avoided. Canon of permanence. This canon states that the characteristics, though relevant and differentiating, should itself not be in a flux. It should be intrinsically permanent and stable in nature. For example, fame should not be used as a criteria for classifying literary authors. Fame is not anything permanent. History of any literature clearly shows the fame or obscurity is transitory and always changing, shaped like a cloud. For example, Shakespeare and Milton were not reputed authors in their times. They are much more reputed and respected now than they were in their own times. Raghunathan satirically cites the example of Indian politicians who more often than not change party affiliations to grab power. They cannot be divided permanently on the basis of their political ideology they subscribe to. Sometimes they go to this group, sometimes they go to another political party. So such persons cannot be absolutely divided. If such a fluctuating characteristic is used as a basis, the members of the various groups will become intermigratory, Ayaram and Gayaram, as they call them. And as a result, we will get only a chaotic classification, a classification in a flux, groups which are intermixing, not segregated ones permanently. Canons of succession of characteristics. Now we come to the second set of canons. To arrive at the desired grouping or the individualization of entities, we have to apply number of characteristics one after the another. Succession means the sequence in which they occur. The next set of canons is concerned with the sequence or the order in which the various characteristics qualifying the canon of characteristics are to be applied. These three canons are canon of concomitance, canon of relevant succession, and canon of consistent succession. The canon of concomitance. This canon states that the two characteristics should not be concomitant. That is, the two characteristics applied successively should not result in the same grouping each time. Such situation may occur if the two characteristics are synonymous, that is, they bring the same result. For example, a teacher may at first divide a class in 2014 on the basis of the students being less or above 20 years of age. It will of course result into two groups. If the next characteristics is chosen as the year of birth being after or before 1994, it will not produce any further grouping as both the characteristics mean the same thing. A group divided on the basis of male-females cannot be further divided on the basis of being men-women. Broader to narrower succession. It also deals with the order in which the characteristics are to be applied, though Ranganathan has not mentioned it clearly or explicitly in his canons. It states, or it means, the successive characteristics should be applied from broader to narrower, from general to specific. A group of females can be further divided into women, girls, and children. A stalemate in further division can occur if the two characteristics are not applied in the order of their decreasing extension or increasing specificity, that is, the order of general to specific. For example, a group of scientists may be divided on the basis of their being biologist and non-biologist. But to apply the characteristics of being scientist to biologist will result in no classification, as all biologists are scientists first. Indians cannot be further divided on the basis of being Asians. It will also violate the canon of differentiation. Ranganathan should have stated this canon explicitly. Canon of relevant succession. To divide a group minutely or rank every member uniquely, we have to apply a number of characteristics as told you earlier. These may be all differentiating, all are permanent, ascertainable, and respect the canon of concomitance. Yet it may be a formidable problem to decide the order in which the various characteristics are to be applied one after the other. Apply characteristics one by one. One important caution is not to apply two or more characteristics simultaneously, otherwise it will result in what is called cross-classification. Array that we produce will not be homogeneous. For example, in the following array, 4 characteristics, language spoken, caste and profession have been applied simultaneously. The arrays Rajputs, Punjabis, Brahmins, army men. Therefore, above group is motally not coherent. In fact, it is no group in the classification sense. It is not an array as it has no common genus. One could be a Punjabi Brahmin or Rajput army man at the same time. Order of their applications. As the name implies, the canon of relevant succession of characteristics depends upon the purpose of classification that we want. There is nothing right or wrong in the order of succession of characteristics subject to the observing the canons of concomitance and increasing specificity. At best, two different sets in succession may be termed as helpful or unhelpful, more helpful or less helpful to the majority of the library users. There are, of course, to quote Arthur Maltby, several useful arrangements in some fields, but the objective is to offer the best of these. Dividing literature. Now let us take some examples. As the first example, division on the basis of literature, which could be useful to the majority of the readers, prescribed in the DDC and CC is successfully by language, form, period of the author, and the title of the work. This is relevant as the majority of readers, being monolingual, are interested in the literature of only one language. Further, within a given library, the majority is interested in one form of the literature, that is either in drama or novel or poetry. Therefore, in such cases, the relevant succession of characteristics is language, form, author, that is period, and work. The order of these characteristics, though popular is not an absolute one. A special classification having a different set of users may change this order of succession of these characteristics, depending upon their purpose and needs. If a library specializes in 19th century literature or world literature, it may prefer the following order of characteristics: literature, period, language, and lastly form. Facet sequence in the universal decimal classification is flexible, especially in case of auxiliaries, which can be altered to suit local requirements. But this is not so in the colon classification or even in the DDC. No order is universal. No sequence of facets is perfect or serve all needs. No classification serves all readers universally. A classificationist is like the proverbial father having two daughters, one married to a potter and another to a farmer. Farmer's wife is urging her father to pray for rain to have bumper crops, while potter's wife asks his father to pray for sunshine for her pots to dry soon. So is the situation of a librarian. One obvious problem with this facet sequence is that an author like Rabindranath Tagore, who writes in different forms, then the works of such an author will be scattered by form. They will not come together on the shelves. In the DDC and the colon classification, the plays, fiction, and poetry of Rabindranath Tagore are filed separately. The UDC, on the other hand, brings together works of a single author at one place by its facet formula. Facet sequence. But this succession of characteristics is subject to the logical principle of facet sequence, which namely wall picture principle, the Koukov principle, and the rest of them. For example, in case of literature, to separate the work facet from the author facet by an intervening facet will be a sheer absurdity. To some extent, the problem of the relevant succession is the problem of relevant characteristics. The various chosen characteristics are to be applied in the decreasing order of their relevance to usefulness. The PEMEST, that is, personality, matter, energy, space, and time formula given by Ranganathan for sequence of categories is in the order of their decreasing concreteness. Here P is the most concrete and T is the least concrete or most abstract of all the categories. The canon of consistent succession. This canon is to ascertain the uniformity and consistency of classification. It purports to be a bulwark or a assurance against the changing tides of fashion, to remain firmly unmoved by the whims and caprices of the person who classifies. In simple words, this canon means that the order of succession of characteristics, once fixed, should not be changed and should always remain so until unless the purpose of library has changed. To summarize, we can say classification is a paradoxical process of dividing to make groups, analysis for synthesis, breaking to reintegrate. For dividing an area or mass of knowledge or some entities, we require a basis of division called characteristics. A characteristic is a sort of hammer to break a group. To break a group into subgroups, we need the right kind of hammer. The guidance is provided by canons of characteristics and the order in which they are to be applied given by Ranganathan in the idea plan of classification work. Idea plan provides theory-based blueprints of the whole work of designing classification carried out in three planes, other being verbal and notational planes. These canons of characteristics lay down that the characteristics chosen should be able to break the group into at least two subgroups differentiation. The breaking should be into larger or smaller groups. The characteristics chosen should not result in the same grouping again, concomitance. The characteristics applied should be relevant to the purpose of classification to serve the needs of the majority of the library users. The canon of ascertainability means the characteristic should be tangible, objective, and knowable. that it should be concrete. Lastly, the characteristics itself should be permanent, not changing or even in flux like rising or falling of mercury. The chosen characteristics should not be fickle. Persons may be classified by their skin color, but not by the color of the clothes they wear, because the color of clothes they wear can be changed. Further, for breaking a mass of knowledge, we have to strike the hammer not once but many times successively to arrive at the right and the desired grouping. More than one characteristics are to be applied in succession. We have to decide the order in which these are to be applied, canons of succession of characteristics. Two characteristics applied should not result in the same grouping, that is canon of concomitance. The order in which these are applied should be relevant to the purpose of majority of the library users. To fulfill the needs of minority users, librarians have devised supplementary approaches in the form of indexes, but that is another area. Lastly, the succession of characteristics chosen should remain the same as long as the purpose of classification remains the same.